Convene. And can I welcome Barbara Allison, former Director of People at the Scottish Government from 2009 to 2016. Ms Allison remains a civil servant as Director of Communications and Ministerial Support. Can I begin, please, by inviting Ms Allison to take the oath? If you would raise your right hand, please, and repeat after me. I swear by Almighty God.
I swear by Almighty God.
That I will tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
That I will tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Thank you. May I invite you, Ms Allison, to give an opening statement explaining your job role and work on policies preceding the complaints procedure.
Thank you, Convener. Convener, this opening statement aims to give some context about my current role as Director of Communications, Ministerial Support and Facilities, and in my previous role as Director of People with regard to the matters that relate to the committee's remit. I've worked with the Scottish Government since 2008, following 14 years with the Scottish Prison Service, latterly as Director of HR there for 5.5 years. I was asked to join SG as Head of HR in January 2008 and was subsequently promoted to Director of HR and Corporate Services in 2009. Since June 2016, I've been Director of Communications, Ministerial Support and Facilities. I thought it would be helpful if I summarise what my involvement has been in matters which have interested the committee to date. I was in charge of HR when the Fairness at Work policy was developed and introduced in 2010. Members of the HR policy team led in the development with regular dialogue with the trade unions. So whilst the team led in the detailed development of the policy, I was aware of the general direction of the work and would have been at the key meetings. I was not directly involved in the development of the policy on the handling of harassment complaints involving current or former ministers. However, I was the individual asked through that period to take on the role to provide pastoral care to staff if required. To be clear, that role is different from the role of the confidential sounding board, which has been discussed at the committee previously. I had some early contact with the two individuals who ultimately became complainants under the policy for handling of harassment complaints. Other than this early initial contact, I had no involvement in the investigation. Finally, as has been set out by others in previous weeks, I'm giving evidence to the committee on behalf of ministers and not in a personal capacity. Convener, as the committee appreciates, this is complex legal territory, and as I have explained, I am privy to certain information that was subject of legal proceedings and the confidentiality of which is now protected. I ask the committee's patience. I am cautious in answering questions in certain matters, or I have to stop and seek advice or follow-up questions in writing with detail to ensure accuracy and to ensure that all the government's legal duties are fulfilled. In line with the approach of other attendees, I would wish to declare that I am a member of the FDA union. Thank you, Convener.
We'll move straight to questions. And first of all, our Deputy Convener, Margaret Mitchell.
Thank you, Convener, and good afternoon, Ms Allison. When you were Head of HR, some people have been kept referring to, also known as Director of People from 2009 to 2016, were any harassment concerns or informal harassment complaints against ministers, including the former First Minister, raised with you under the new 2010 Fairness at Work policy in the period from 2010 to 2014?
So I was aware of not specific complaints, but I was aware of issues that had been raised through the trade unions. But I wasn't aware of any specific complaints.
Okay, thank you. Under the Fairness at Work policy, if a complaint passed to you as Head of HR or Director of People could not be resolved informally and was put in writing, then it had to be passed to the Permanent Secretary or the Deputy First Minister. Were any complaints put in writing? In that case, did you escalate any of these harassment concerns or informal complaints to the Permanent Secretary, Peter Housden, or the Deputy First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon?
No.
No, okay. Did you ever discuss or use any other form of communication to informally make the Deputy First Minister aware of any harassment complaints or any harassment concerns or informal complaints in this period of 2010 to 2014, because we know from St Peter's evidence there was a prevailing culture of bullying behaviour and a level of concern about the instances or that culture as it prevailed.
So perhaps it'd be helpful if I was absolutely clear. I was not aware of any issues about sexual harassment. I would just quite like to be clear about that. So, so just for clarity, but I did not raise any issues about bullying harassment with either the Permanent Secretary or the Deputy First Minister.
Okay, thank you.
Hamilton.
Thank you, Convener. So thank you very much for coming to see us today, Barbara Allison. Ms Allison, so Peter Howson revealed to us that office life in the very inner sanctum around Alex Salmond was often punctuated by incidents of bullying behaviour. That was his word by Mr Salmond, and he would seek to handle those issues on an informal basis. Did he ever discuss his approach to these problems with you as Director of People? Okay. Do you recall a time when he raised those behaviours directly with the Deputy First Minister, or were you aware of that? Okay. Were you aware of an organisational scuttlebutt around concerns of Mr Salmond's behaviour, firstly in terms of bullying behaviour?
So I was aware that Mr Salmond could be demanding and could be difficult to work for. He expected high standards, and if he didn't get that, then you know, he would express his displeasure. I would like to say, for fairness, that people also expressed that they enjoyed working for him. He was visionary, he was dynamic, it was a bit of a roller coaster. So, you know, I think there was lots of shades of grey. So there were rumours of, as I said, him being demanding and difficult, but I think, you know, people had different experiences of working with him.
And so you never, just for clarity, you never heard any kind of rumour around sexual misconduct on the part of him?
Absolutely
okay.
not.
That's fine. Just moving on to the your role as a pastoral care officer for the complainers, and I'm glad to hear there was such a post put in to help them. You said you had early contact with people that would go on to make complaints under the new procedure. When did you first learn about their allegations in terms of was it during your role as Director of People, or was it much later when the procedure was instituted and they raised those complaints?
So I will watch with the convener here and just make sure that she intervenes if she feels. I was aware of nothing at all about any allegations about sexual harassment until 2017. Okay,
so that's when you first learned. And then finally, I'll take a break after the next question to let other people in, but I do have a few follow-ups. So do you, just for clarity, are you as the sort of chalk face role in terms of the day-to-day management of people in the organisation, were you ever aware of informal circumstances where people were moved around or working practices changed because of friction with Mr Salmond?
So at the time, no, I wasn't. I have subsequently become aware that arrangements were put in place, but I was not aware at the time. I think, having said that, I think moving people is quite an appropriate way to deal with issues if people aren't, you know, getting on. Sir Peter mentioned, I think, well, I would call it chemistry. So I think, particularly in private offices, I think it's very important that there's good chemistry between ministers and their private office, and that, you know, that they gel well. So, you know, if either in private office or another area it was appropriate to move somebody on an informal basis, I think that's perfectly appropriate.
Okay, that's it for now. Thanks.
Allison Johnson.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning still. Can I ask, you've highlighted your own early involvement with the complainants, and I would just like to ask, you know, we've heard in earlier sessions that complainant was party to an early sight of a draft procedure. So when you were in post as Director of People, would sharing draft HR policies with individuals be typical?
I mean, we certainly would engage widely with trade unions, obviously, with networks, So we have a lot of staff networks around LGBTI, race, disability, etc. So we would share drafts with them. I'm not aware of sharing it with any particular individuals, but certainly we'd want to make sure that, you know, we were taking views of staff widely.
To share it with a specific individual? Would there be a reason why an individual was chosen apart from the areas you've highlighted?
I mean, I am aware of, or my understanding of why it was shared in this case was, had this policy been in place, this procedure been in place at the time, would this have helped in terms of raising an issue? You know, I think that, you know, so in terms of would this have made a difference? So that's my understanding of why it was shared on this occasion.
Okay, you've said that you were aware of issues being raised, but that no formal complaints were made. So do you have any concerns that staff were reluctant to take that next step? In our earlier session this morning with Mr. Houston, he made the point, which is quite reasonable, that you wouldn't always want to go to, to take that step where it unnecessary. But there seems to be a culture of, great focus on informal means of addressing issues, for example, moving staff. Mm-hmm. Do you feel there was enough support for staff who felt that they may want to go further?
I mean, our statistics for the formal complaints raised are low. And that may lead you to believe then that people were reluctant to do that. I am a great believer in informal resolution, and I don't think that's, I suppose, I'm concerned slightly that it feels like it's an easy option. Or, I mean, I think if you can get in early and resolve an issue between two individuals, nip it in the bud, clarify it's often lack of communication or a misunderstanding, then I think and the Fairness at Work policy supports that. So the individual contact with the line manager to see if they can resolve it, informal contact with HR, and if they can't, then you can go on a formal basis. So I am a trained mediator, and I'm part of the mediation network that we use. And I am a huge advocate for the informal resolution. However, if it can't be resolved, then absolutely people must have recourse to a formal process.
And what's your view on the, the evidence of trade union representatives who suggested that it was often the individual who raised the complaint who was moved, and that while perhaps managing an immediate concern, this approach failed to address, wider issues within the organisation?
I mean, I think I listened with great interest, as you'd imagine, to the trade unions' evidence. And to be honest, I think when I was in HR or as line manager generally, I think it can be frustrating if there are issues that come to, or that people don't raise issues. But I think people very often want to go to the unions or come to a line manager to air things and don't necessarily want action taken. They want somebody to hear and to share an experience with. I mean, as I said to Mr. Cole-Hamilton, I think if there is an issue, the best thing is to resolve it. An answer may be to move people. I don't think that's necessarily a bad option. I think it's been portrayed, as I said, that it's wrong. Sometimes that is, if people aren't getting on, you move somebody. It's a very large organisation we work for. There's over 7,000 people. There's lots of opportunities. It doesn't mean to say that it's detrimental to somebody's career to be moved.
What are your views on the efficacy of a process that doesn't have an independent element? And I think Mr. Penman from the FDA, I think, was quite clear that the lack of that independent investigator has had, well, we understand the impact in our current work, but what are your views on the lack of that independent investigator?
I think if it's an employment contract, I think there's an employment tribunal externally somebody can go to. I think there are a number of ways where people can have their issue raised and looked at out with the line independently, still within the organisation. I think we will obviously look at, in the fullness of time, with the Lord and Lot review and this committee's considerations, whether we need more independence. But I think, when you're dealing with an employment situation, I think, there's informal, formal, and there's appeal mechanisms, and there's external appeal mechanisms. So I would hope that there's sufficient, impartiality within the organisation to ensure that people feel that they're dealt with on an impartial basis.
And did you feel during your time as Director of People that the Fairness at Work policy, its operation, did you feel that it was fit for purpose, or was it clear to you that it had to be improved?
So when we introduced it in 2010, it was took the Dignity at Work policy, which had come in 2003 and was updated in 2005, 2007. So there was a number of steps brought in 2010 with that. It clarified unacceptable behaviour, the roles of the line manager, the roles of countersigning manager. It really emphasised the importance of mediation, etc. I think it's right. People Directorate were looking to review fairness at work in 2017, so I think it's right that policies are reviewed over time to ensure that they're still fit for purpose. I think that with policies, I think timescales are an issue. I think how long it takes to resolve things, so I think that's an issue. But I think the Fairness at Work policy in and of itself provides mechanisms to resolve issues. I think it is fit for purpose. I think like any, it should be reviewed at a point in time.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Convener.
Angela Constance has some questions around the same theme as raised.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning to Miss Allison. Given your experience as a previous Director of People over several years, 2009 to 2016, I wondered if you had a view about the evidence we've heard from Peter Housden and his suggestion of an external independent process in terms of dealing with complaints against ministers, such as a Parliamentary Standards Commissioner. Now, he did say that this would not be a substitute for good HR practice and that there were details in and around governance, issues about accountability of ministers to Parliament and such like. But he felt that there could be, a significant merit. It could have a material effect, could be a guarantor and a place of last resort. And I just wondered, Miss Allison, what your views would be of an external independent process, and actually how could that be made to work to good effect?
I think, as Sir Peter said, I think the issue about governance around how such a process would work with the Ministerial Code, etc., would be really important. And I know that some of the work that the People Directorate are looking at and had started was to look at how our current policies worked with the Ministerial Code. So I think it's really understanding how these various processes would dovetail into one another. I think that would be quite important. I don't know, Miss Constance, obviously having been a minister yourself, I think that the relationship between civil servants and ministers is really important, and there's a lot of trust there, and I think if there's bringing in an independent person into that, would that change the relationship? I don't know. I certainly think it's something we would need to think quite carefully about, and whether there'd be unintended consequences if that was done.
And what about if it was a more tiered approach? Because both you and Peter Housden have spoke about informal processes and the value of that, and then there are more formalised processes, and obviously there is indeed the Ministerial Code, but is there a place for somewhere along the line in some circumstances for the benefit of an external independent person?
There may well be. I think as you've rightly said, there are a number of processes already in place in terms of informal and formal, and maybe ultimately there's an independent. But I think in the fullness of time, we'll be able to consider these things.
Okay, thanks, Convener.
Maureen Watt and then Jackie Bailey.
Thank you, Convener. Morning, Ms Allison. Sir Peter talked about meeting once or twice a year with the trade unions formally. Were you involved in those, but did you also have more informal interactions yourself with the trade unions?
So yes, there'll be a twice yearly sort of partnership board where senior officials would meet the trade union officials. But we would routinely have, regular meetings with the trade unions on a sort of formal basis, and we would also have reasonably regular informal, you have good productive relationships, so if there were issues that we're aware of, they're not usually shy of picking up the phone and making you aware of things.
So were you contacted by trade unions about specific complaints
No.
against ministers? Never.
No, not specific, no.
So in HR, there's always, you never know whether an individual will go to the line manager first. The line manager may be, in fact, the person that they've got some problems with. So can you recall any situations where you were contacted directly by anyone in the civil service in relation to their interaction with ministers?
Not in my role as Director of People. More recently in my role in terms of Director of my long title, Communications, Ministerial Support and Facilities. So more recently, I have been contacted by people who would want to discuss with me their interactions with ministers.
That's post the former First Minister being in post.
Yes, it is.
Okay. And in terms of the fairness at work policy being revised and the ministerial code being revised as well, do you think that as an HR person, they are currently fit for purpose, or is there more revision required?
I think, as I said to Ms Johnson, I think fairness at work has been in place since 2010, slightly updated to take account of the new procedure. I think it's absolutely right that it should be reviewed, and it had been started in 2017 by People Directorate, and I know they had done a lot of work in terms of what that might look like, but it has been halted at the moment. So, I think it's perfectly appropriate that it is reviewed in due course.
And in terms of policies being retrospective insofar as it can cover former complaints, is that something that's now standard in organisations or not?
I think certainly, I think as Sir Peter said, I think since 2017, I think people will be reviewing their policies to ensure that if staff want to raise complaints or issues, that they're able to do so, and there's nothing within a policy that would stop them doing that. I think it's really important.
Okay, thank you.
Jackie Bailey.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, Mrs Allison. Now, I'm not interested in talking about individuals, so let me make that clear at the start, and I'm happy to take short and direct answers. Can I ask you, were you involved in the Edinburgh Airport press inquiry, and can you recall what date was that and what was your role?
So I'm aware of staff being approached about the Edinburgh Airport incident. So I'm not trying to be difficult. So I'm aware at the start of November 2017, we were conscious that there was a potential press inquiry about Edinburgh Airport.
Can you remember what day in November that was?
I
If
think
I said the 6th, would that,
6th, that
the
was what I was
6th of
going to say,
November?
6th, yeah.
Okay. What was your role in that? You became aware. What was your role?
My role was that 2 members of staff contacted me to let me know that they had been contacted about a potential press inquiry.
Okay, thank you. I understand you were appointed to a special role by the current Permanent Secretary. Could you tell me what that role was and when you were appointed?
This is the pastoral care role. So I got a letter from the Permanent Secretary on the 11th of November 2017, and the purpose of that was twofold. One, that a number of people had been contacted by the press, and she was keen that they were given appropriate support if required. And the second thing was we were conscious that there had been, as a result of the staff messages that Permanent Secretary issued, that there had been some people coming forward. And because of my responsibilities at the time, that it was likely that people from the current private office or comms might be people that would come forward. So she asked me if I would just add some support, point them towards, support mechanisms available, any issues, make HR aware.
So between the 6th and the 11th, you must have alerted to the Permanent Secretary to the fact that staff members had approached you about Edinburgh Airport. Can you recall when that was?
I don't think I made the Permanent Secretary aware of the Edinburgh Airport. I think somebody else did, of the Edinburgh Airport issue. So I don't think it's me.
you have no recollection of telling her. Did you tell somebody else to tell her?
I think she was contacted by somebody else, yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. Can I move us on to just touch on the judicial review and the commission of documents in December 2018? Did you appear before that commission?
I did.
You did. Could you ask me, could I ask you even, whether documents or text messages or anything that you were involved in that you had to speak to the commission about?
Yes, I spoke about particularly text messages and whether I had any documentation.
Okay, could you tell us what the text messages showed?
I'm just checking with the convener. It's in connection with my early contact with one of the people who ultimately became a complainant. So there was text correspondence between us at the time.
Okay, did you text the Permanent Secretary at all?
No.
To warn her about a potential complaint coming in?
I didn't text her, I spoke to the Permanent Secretary.
Okay. Can you tell me when that was? Just so I've got a feel for the timeline.
I spoke to the Permanent Secretary on the 9th of November.
9th of November.
Sorry, can I just be clear, at that point there was a concern had been raised. Okay. There's no complaint, sorry, just being absolutely clear.
To be honest, we've kind of covered this before. Okay. Concerns and complaints to me, when it's serious misconduct, are the one and the same. I think you would agree with that, wouldn't you?
Well, I'm very conscious that it did not become a complaint.
Sure. No, I get that, but the seriousness of it makes it something different. So just so I get the chronology right, you knew about the press story in relation to Edinburgh Airport on the 6th of November.
Yes.
You had a discussion with the Permanent Secretary on the 9th of November.
Yes.
And you were then appointed on the 11th of November to your new role with pastoral care.
So the pastoral care was really just an adjunct to my current role. It wasn't.
No, I understand that. It's just so I can get the timeline right. Can I make us look just a bit further ahead? And I've got two final questions for you. The first, obviously, by the time we get to August 2018, there was a police investigation underway. Okay, and I think you'd probably agree it would be inappropriate for anybody to have been in contact with potential witnesses or former civil servants. Yes. Did you have any such contact? Were you encouraged to email anybody?
No.
No, that's helpful to know. Obviously, we heard about text messages, and last week my colleague Murdo Fraser raised a text message from the Permanent Secretary, which was sent in January 2019. It said, "We may have lost the battle, but we will win the war." Was that to you?
No.
It wasn't to you?
No.
You didn't receive a text message like that? It's interesting. Okay. Did you have any discussion with the Permanent Secretary about that?
No.
Afterwards, nothing. Okay, that's fine. Thank you very much.
Okay. Can I have Allison Allen, please, followed by Murdo Fraser.
Thank you, Convener. You've touched on the issue there about the pastoral support that you provided and how that became a new part of your role. In some of the evidence submitted, or some of the evidence that we have, there is correspondence describing how that pastoral support was provided, particularly in the private office and communications at various points. Can you explain more about that and about how that role worked?
the pastoral care role.
Yes.
So it was really just to, I think the Permanent Secretary just wanted to make sure that if people had concerns about anything that was coming out in the media or anything like that, they had somebody to go to. So my physical location in St Andrew's House is just beside where most of the communications staff work, and it's one floor down from a lot of private office. So I was sort of physically available if people wanted to pop in for a chat, and it was really just to make sure that they had somebody that they knew they could come and talk to if they needed additional support.
So how did it work in that case? You mentioned there the press or the media side of this. How did it work if you were providing pastoral support at the same time as, it would appear, dealing to some extent with media inquiries? How did those two things relate to each other?
So, in terms of media inquiries, so, obviously a media team, so they would be picking up any media inquiries, etc. So the role, the pastoral care role was really about just providing, making sure that individuals had somebody to come to if they wanted to, just raise.
So if somebody was approached by the press, your role was providing assurances to them rather than to the press?
If people were approached by the press, on occasions they'd be anxious about how they should respond to that. So they would be given advice about what whether they had to respond, etc. So that would be general support to staff for media handling. The pastoral care one was literally just to be there if anybody wanted to come and say, I'm concerned that things are coming out, and this feels tough. Where can I go for support? So you would mention trade unions, you mention welfare officer, you mention the EAP, etc., the employee assistance programme.
Can I ask more generally a point that came up in conversation with Sir Peter just now, which was about the apparent mismatch as the years went on between the concerns expressed in the staff survey and the number, this was the point that was raised with Sir Peter, the relatively low number of people willing to come forward to make complaints. Did you feel that in your involvement as things went on, that the civil service was learning from that difficult situation and was in any way overcoming some of the obstacles which stand in the way of people making such complaints?
I think there are a range of ways people can raise issues, and I think going formal is quite a significant thing to do. But I think we have worked really hard at making sure that people have a lot of support. So Peter mentioned monthly conversations. We've got networks, people have mentors, line managers, trade unions, etc. So there's a number of ways that people can, I think, get support individually if they're, if they feel they want to discuss anything with people. So, I think that it's an area that over the years, in terms of our culture, successive permanent secretaries have invested heavily into being a much more supportive environment, etc.
Thank you, Convener.
Thank you. Can I ask, just before I move on to Murdo Fraser, we've heard over the weeks about a sounding board that was in place. Is that the same role as the pastoral care role, or is it completely separate?
No, it's a separate role. They were both set up at the same time, but this was that's a separate role. And I understand a number of people approached the person who's doing that role, but I wasn't involved in that.
Okay, thank you. Murdo Fraser.
Thank you, Convener. I was just going to say, given other members have covered the territory I was going to raise, to save time, I'm happy to pass on.
Oh, thank you very much for that. I do have another couple of members anxious to come back in. Alex Cole-Hamilton.
I'm conscious that maybe others haven't had an opportunity to ask for the first time, so do they want to come in first? Oh, you've all been. Okay, thank you very much. It's just that my...
Oh, your colleagues are memorable to you.
My apologies. So thank you very much for bringing me back in, Convener. I'm very keen to explore further your role as the pastoral care support for the people that would go on to lodge formal complaints. Can I ask, when you were supporting them, did you ever get the impression that they had been encouraged to formalise their complaints by other civil servants?
So, if you're talking about two individuals specifically, I had very early, very limited contact with one, and slightly more contact with the second. And that contact effectively spoke to them and then handed them over, you know, as appropriate in terms of to HR, so that they were aware of the issues. I had no, there's no suggestion that they were being encouraged to come forward.
Okay. And in terms of after the collapse of the judicial review and thereby the collapse of the investigation, did you continue to support them in any way after that?
I've had no contact with one since November 17, and I have the second one since middle of January 2018.
So you did have some contact at that point?
January.
After the judicial review judgment?
No, this was
Okay.
a year
I
earlier,
understand.
sorry.
My apologies, yeah, of course it is. The reason I ask this is this procedure clearly failed the very people it was designed to serve. It left women exposed and denied both any kind of recognition or any sense of justice. And I'm just keen, I think it's really important this committee understands the impact that would have on those women. And I'm concerned to hear that your pastoral role stopped before then. What kind of pastoral support was offered to these women after the collapse of the judicial review, or do you have no knowledge of that?
No, so it would not have been appropriate for me to have continued my contact with them beyond the initial contact I had. So I wasn't involved with the ongoing support for them. And, you know, I would imagine colleagues in People Directorate, you know, would have done that. So, but I wasn't involved in it.
And you're not clear that there was any formal pastoral officer appointed to them to support them in the aftermath?
I wasn't involved in that amount of detail.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Convener.
Can we just be clear that there are times when committee members are giving their view of a situation? And a supplementary question from Jackie Bailey.
Yes, this isn't a view. This is a question, Convener. Can I ask? I forgot to ask you earlier. Have you had any interaction with special advisors since November 2017? And I wonder if you could detail that.
I mean, so special advisors fall within my remit.
Just in general.
Whilst they're appointed by the First Minister for their board and lodgings, if you like, they fall within my remit. So I would have regular contact with special advisors.
Okay. Can I ask, since November 2017, have you had any contact about the issues before us? Either the policy, the judicial review, any complaints? Was there any interaction in relation to the issue before us?
So not in connection with the policy development, judicial review. No, I'm not, I don't remember anything, I don't recall any contact in relation to this.
Okay, so not prior to the commission for documents that you went and spoke at, there was nothing? I mean, I recognise memory has been an issue for the committee, but, you know, it's quite important that if you can recall, that would be helpful.
So, so not about the specifics of the investigation or the development.
About the generalities of the investigation and development?
I mean,
any conversation?
So in terms of, yeah, there would be conversations with special advisors on occasions, yes.
Okay, so you know, whether it was the stuff of the water cooler moments that my colleague Alex Cole-Hamilton refers to, there was kind of general discussion, maybe not in great detail, but there was general discussion.
So not about specifics of any of the allegations?
No, but in, I'm trying to be as helpful as I can. Not about the specific allegations, but generally what was going on during this period in relation to the policy, the judicial review, etc.
So yes, so I would be in meetings where the special advisors would be there.
Okay. Did you have any knowledge of rotas being changed in any part of, you know, either private office or anything associated with ministers?
I was not aware of anything at the time. I subsequently have become aware.
Okay. Okay, thank you very much.
To round off this session, Margaret Mitchell.
Thank you, Convener. Ms. Allison, you mentioned that you had twice yearly meetings with the TUC and the Partnership Board and regular meetings with the TUC, the union members. Were you aware of why the unions insisted the revised fairness of work policy should include ministers?
I think they raised with us at the time, and I think in their evidence said that over a number of years before the 2010 policy, that they had had concerns raised by their members. They had no specific concerns, and there was general concerns had been raised. They didn't raise anything specific with us, but my understanding was because of over a number of years, issues had been raised.
Specifically, that was about the behaviour in ministerial offices without, being any more specific than that.
I wouldn't even say it was about in ministerial offices because, it might have been with policy officials, etc. So it wouldn't necessarily have been in connection with private office.
Right, I think I would need to go back because it was my understanding that they had raised concerns about ministerial office behaviour, and that's why they had included ministers and insisted ministers would be covered by the Fairness at Work policy. And this was concerns raised with them by their union members.
So my understanding, recollection was it was general concerns about ministers' behaviour, and I'm not sure that I could confirm that it was about private office.
Well, ministers' behaviour then. Did you alert the Permanent Secretary or the Deputy First Minister about these concerns that the unions had raised?
There was nothing specific to alert the Permanent Secretary to. It was general. They were raising general concerns. There was nothing specific.
But don't you think that the Permanent Secretary and the Deputy First Minister should have been made aware you had a duty of care to the civil servant?
So just to be clear, sorry, we introduced the ministers into the 2010 policy on the back of general concerns that were being raised. To introduce that policy, the Permanent Secretary was clearly aware because he was required to agree the policy, and the Permanent Secretary spoke to the First Minister at the time to bring that policy into place. So that was done in advance of the 2010 policy came into place. So the Permanent Secretary was aware we were changing the policy, and that the Permanent Secretary raised that with the First Minister at the time.
Right, and that was the First Minister. You didn't think it appropriate then to raise it with the Deputy First Minister, who under the Fairness at Work revised policy, had there been a written complaint, and I think that was quite a stumbling block and quite a huge obstacle to people, taking their complaints forward. You don't think it would have been appropriate to raise it with her?
We had no specific complaints to raise with the Deputy First Minister.
Did it have to be specific complaints if general complaints had been raised with the union about behaviour in ministerial offices?
I think that if I went to the Deputy First Minister and said we've got general complaints, she would want some specifics. I mean, we weren't getting anything forward.
Mm-hmm. So did it concern you that people felt they could raise these with their unions, but they couldn't come to the people who they might have expected to have a duty of care and to be there with a policy to support them?
I think the unions like ourselves were concerned if there were issues that people weren't coming forward with. But it's up to the individual to decide how they want to deal with it. If they want to, I think Dave Penman was very articulate in his, people want to come and talk to them, but it's up to the individual whether they want to make a formal complaint or not. And if they weren't getting specifics, then they weren't getting anything to raise with us, and there's nothing that we could take forward.
Thank you.
That concludes our question session, and can I thank Barbara Allison for her evidence. It's the public evidence session concluded for today.